Hello, everyone. This is Suzanne at the Gospel Truth. Today is December 8th. Today we are in chapter 12 of the book we've been reading through, The Hiding Place. It's Corrie Ten Bloom is telling us her life, about how they lived in Holland. They were Dutch, a Dutch family, and during the occupation of the Nazis, they became involved in hiding Jews from the Nazis. And they had a secret room in their home that the Nazis, I don't believe, ever did find. And the Nazis were very frustrated over this. And we know that several of their friends and even family members have died. They are in prison. And the last we left off, there was a great prayer that William said, and I'll be repeating that in just a few moments. It's a prayer perhaps that we should be doing more often. All right, once again, I want to remind you, on the 17th of December, I will be drawing a name to win a book written by Corrie Ten Bloom on their devotionals. And a lot of them are when she was in prison and how she handled different happenings in her life. It's a very, very nice book. But you have to make a comment in the drop-down box below to let me know you've been following this series, whether you are up to date on them or you are straggling behind. It doesn't matter. That's the only way I know to put your name in the drawing. So if you haven't done so and you're watching, please leave a comment in today's video, because I am keeping track of the names. All right, I don't want anybody to miss out on that great drawing that we're going to be having. All right, they had just got done talking with Lieutenant Raumes. He's been pretty nice to them, and there was a reading of her father's will, and in the will, it said the BG was to be home for Betsy and me as long as we wanted it. Should there be any money left from the sale of the house or watch shop, he knew we would recall his equal love for us all. He committed us with joy to the constant care of God. And that's a phrase we want to concentrate on, the constant care of God. I think that's the place we all want to be. In the silence that followed, we all bowed our heads. Lord Jesus, William said, we praise you for these moments together under the protection of this good man. How can we thank him? We have no power to do him any service. Lord, allow us to share this inheritance from our Father with him as well. Take him, too, and his family into your constant care. I don't know what effect that would have had on the lieutenant, but I'm sure it must have touched his heart very deeply. All right, the next chapter, chapter 12. And we're just going to continue reading until we get through with chapter 12. I'm not sure how long that will be, but we'll get through it. And a lot of you are probably like me. You're on pins and needles waiting for the rest of the... my husband's over there yelling like, get on with it already, get on with it. Oh, he can be patient. All right, the next chapter is Vucht. I can't even begin to pronounce that. All right, here we go. Are you excited? I am. Get ready to evacuate. Collect all your possessions. The shouts of the guards echoed up and down the corridor. I stood in the center of my cell in a frenzy of excitement. We were leaving the prison. The counter-invasion must have begun. I grabbed the pillowcase from the cot. What riches this coarse bit of cloth had been in the 2 weeks since it had been provided. A shield for my head from the scratch and smell of the bedding. It almost did not matter that the promised sheets never arrived. I dropped my few belongings into it. My Bible was in its pouch on my back. I put on my coat and hat and stood at the iron door clutching the pillowcase. An hour passed. I sat on the cot. 2 hours. 3. I took off my hat and coat. More time passed. I kept my eyes on the ant hole, hoping for a last visit from my small friends, but they did not appear. I reached into the pillowcase, took one of the crackers, and crumbled it all about the little crack. No ants. They were staying safely hidden. I pressed a finger to the tiny crevice. All at once there was a clanging out in the corridor. Doors scraped, bolts banged. Out! Snell! No talking. I snatched up my hat and coat. My door screeched open. The guard was already at the next cell. I stepped out into the hall. It was jammed from wall to wall. I had never dreamed so many women occupied this corridor. We exchanged looks. Where would we be taken? Not into Germany. Dear Jesus, not Germany. The command was given, and we shuffled forward down the long, chilly halls, each carrying a pillowcase with her belongings. As we emerged into the wide courtyard inside the front of the prison, and another long wait began with the late afternoon sun on our backs. I could not see Betsy anywhere. The huge gate swung in, and a convoy of gray transport buses drove through. I was herded aboard the third one. The seats had been removed, the windows painted over. The bus lurched as it started up, but we were standing too close together to fall. When the bus ground to a stop, we were at a freight yard somewhere on the outskirts of the city. Sounds like they're pretty tightly cramped in these buses. Again, we were formed into ranks. The guards' voices were tense and shrill. We had to keep our heads facing forward. Yes, front. Behind us, we could hear buses arriving, then lumbering away again. Then, ahead of me, in the newest group arriving, and here's a picture. It must have been awfully hot in there. Then ahead of me, in the newest group of arriving prisoners, I spotted Betsy. Somehow, someway, I was going to get to her. Slowly, the June day faded. At last, a long row of unlit train coaches rode slowly over the tracks in front of us. By the time the order came to board, it was pitch black. The prisoners surged forward. Behind us, the guards shouted. Obviously, they were nervous at transporting so many prisoners at one time. I wriggled and shoved until at the very steps of the train, I reached out and seized Betsy's hand. Together we climbed onto the train. Together found seats in a crowded compartment. Together we wept in gratitude. I can imagine being separated for so long and now to be reunited together. The 4 months in Tübingen had been our first separation in 53 years. It seemed to me that I could bear whatever happened with Betsy beside me. Hours passed as the loaded train sat on the siding. Betsy told me about each of her cellmates, and I told her about mine and the little hole into which they scrambled at any emergency. As always, Betsy had given to others everything she had. The Bible that Nolly had smuggled to her, she had torn up and passed around, book by book. The train at last began to move. You know, here they are, tearing up and passing around book by book this Bible. How many people are they that just let their Bibles lay on a table or on a bookshelf, never to be read, not realizing how precious the word of the Lord is? The train at last began to move. We pressed our faces to the glass, but no light showed, and the clouds covered the moon. I must have fallen asleep, for when I opened my eyes, the train had stopped. Voices were shouting at us to move. An eerie glare lit the windows. Betsy and I stumbled after the others along the aisle and down the iron steps. We seemed to have stopped in the middle of a woods. Flashlights mounted in trees lit a broad, rough, cleared path lined by soldiers with leveled guns. Spurred by the shouts of the guards, we started up the path between the gun barrels. "Keep up!" Betsy's breath was coming short and hard as they yelled at us to go faster. I took Betsy's pillowcase along with mine, hooked my other arm through hers, and hauled her along beside me. The nightmare march lasted a mile or more. Wow. Here they're cold, not feeling good. She's helping her sister after being on this long train ride, not knowing where they're going, what's up. At last we came to a barbed-wired fence surrounding a row of wooden barracks. There were no beds in the one we entered, only long tables with backless benches pulled up to them. Betsy and I collapsed onto one of these. Under my arm, I could feel the irregular flutter of her heart. We fell into an exhausted sleep, our heads on the table. The sun streamed through the barracks windows when we woke up. We were thirsty and hungry. We had had nothing to eat or drink since the early meal at Sevingen the morning before. But all that day, no guard or any official person appeared inside the barracks. Now, she's 53, and I can't imagine, I'm 73, and I'm sure there were prisoners that were that age and older than her, not feeling good, probably having chronic pain issues, not getting enough food to eat. It must have been horrible beyond measure. I can't even imagine that. At last, when the sun was low in the sky, a prisoner crew arrived with a great vat of some thick, steamy substance that we gobbled ravenously. The camp, we learned, was named Vault. Unlike Scheveningen, which had been a regular Dutch prison, Vault had been constructed especially as a concentration camp for political prisoners. We were in kind of a quarantine and compound outside. Our biggest problem was idleness. Wedged together as we were around the long rows of tables with nothing to do, we were guarded by the same young woman who had patrolled the corridors at Scheveningen. The young guard's only technique for maintaining discipline was to shriek obscenities. So, can you imagine being shrieked at with obscenities all day long? I think that would wear on you mentally. Only one of our 4 overseers never threatened or raised her voice. This was the tall hand matron from Scheveningen. She appeared in Vault the 3rd morning and seized our untidy ranks. Lines straightened and whispers ceased as those cold blue eyes swept across us. Among ourselves, we nicknamed her the General. We had been in this outer camp at Vault for almost 2 weeks when Betsy and I, along with a dozen others, were moved again. That day, after hours of processing in this office and that office, we found ourselves marching between twisted rows of barbed wire. We arrived in a yard surrounded on 3 sides by low concrete buildings. These were barracks, almost identical with the one we had left this morning, except that this one was furnished with bunks as well as tables and benches. We were not allowed to sit. There was a long wait while the matron, with maddening deliberateness, checked off our documents against the lids. "Betsy," I wailed, "how long will it take?" Perhaps a long, long time. But what better way could there be to spend our lives? I turned to stare at her. "Whatever are you talking about?" "Corrie, if people can be taught to hate, they can be taught to love. We must find the way, you and I, no matter how long it takes." She went on, almost forgetting in her excitement to keep her voice to a whisper, while I slowly took in the fact that she was talking about our guards. I glanced at the matron seated at the desk ahead of us. I saw a gray uniform and a visored hat. Betsy saw a wounded human being. Wow. the worst of people, and all Betsy sees is a wounded human being. Perhaps we need to look more at people as wounded human beings and show them the love of Christ. And I wondered again what sort of a person she was, this sister of mine, what kind of road she followed while I trudged beside her on the all-too-solid earth. A few days later, Betsy and I were called up for work assignments. One glance at Betsy's pallid face and fragile form, and the matron waved her back inside the barracks, where the elderly and infirm spent the day sewing prison uniforms. The women's uniform here in Vault was a blue overhaul, practical and comfortable, and a welcome change from our own clothes that we had worn since the day of our arrest. I was told to report to the factory, actually just another large barracks inside the camp complex. I followed my escort into the single large room, where several hundred men and women sat at long plank tables covered with thousands of tiny radio parts. 2 officers, 1 male, 1 female, strode the aisles between the benches while the prisoners bent to their task. I was assigned a seat at a bench and given the job of measuring small glass rods and arranging them in piles according to lengths. It was monotonous work. I longed to exchange at least names with my neighbors on either side, but the only sound in the room was the clink of metal parts and the squeak of the officers' boots. Production was up again last week, the male officer said in German to a tall, slender man with a shaved head and striped uniform. You are to be commended for this increase, but we continue to receive complaints of defective wiring. Quality control must improve. The shaved-headed man made an apologetic gesture. If there were more food, Herr Officer, he murmured. Since the cutback in rations, I see a difference. They grow sleepy. They have trouble concentrating. His voice reminded me of little Williams, the German with only a trace of Dutch accent. Then you must wake them up. If the soldiers on the front can fight on half rations, then these lazy... As I looked from the woman officer, he stopped. I speak, of course, merely as an example. There is naturally no truth in the rumor that rations at the front are reduced. So, I hold you responsible. And together the officers stalked from the building. For a moment, the prisoner foreman watched them from the doorway. Slowly he raised his left hand, then dropped it with a slap to his side. The quiet room exploded. People left their benches and joined little knots of chattering friends all over the room. Half a dozen crowded around me. Who was I? Where was I from? Did I have any news of the war? In perhaps half an hour of visiting among the tables, the foreman reminded us that we had a day's quota to meet. The foreman's name, I learned, was Moorman. He came over to my workbench the 3rd day I was there. He had heard that I had followed the entire assembly line, tracing what became of my little pile of rods. You're the first woman worker, he said, who has shown interest in what we are making here. I am very interested, I said. I am a watchmaker. He stared at me with a new interest. Then I have work you will enjoy more. He took me to the opposite end of the huge shed, where the final assembly of relay switches was done. It was intricate and exacting work, though not nearly so hard as watch repair. And Mr. Moorman was right. I enjoyed it, and it helped make the 11th hour workday go faster. Not only to me, but to all the workers. Mr. Moorman acted more as a kindly older brother than a crew boss. I would watch him moving among his hundreds of charges, counseling, encouraging, finding a simpler job for the weary, a harder one for the restless. He stopped frequently at my bench in the first weeks. Eventually his eyes traveled to the row of relay switches in front of me. Dear watch lady, can you not remember for whom you are working? These radios are for their fighter planes. And reaching across me, he would yank a wire from its housing or twist a tiny tune from an assembly. Now solder them back wrong and not so fast. You're over the day's quota and it's not yet noon. he's telling her to solder them back wrong.
Did you do it wrong?
Yeah, that's interesting. At lunchtime, prisoners on kitchen detail lugged in great buckets of great gruel made from wheat and peas, tasteless but nourishing. Apparently, there had been a cutback in rations recently. Still, the food was better and more plentiful than at Shivingen, where there had been no noonday meal at all. After eating, we were free for a blessed half hour to stroll about within the factory compound, in the fresh air and the glorious sun. Most days I found a spot along the fence and stretched out on the warm ground to sleep. The day started with roll call at 5 a.m. Sweet summer smells came in breezes, and sometimes I would dream that Carl and I were walking hand in hand along a country lane. Memories are important, very, very important. And drawing on memories in harsh times can encourage us. And especially when it's memories of God's Word, which I believe Corrie and her sisters and brother were well versed growing up. Okay, let's continue on. We're at 21 minutes now, but I'm going to continue on. We have maybe 3 or 4 more pages. At 6 in the evening, there was another roll call. Then we marched back to our various sleeping barracks. Betsy always stood in the doorway of ours waiting for me. Each evening there was so much to tell one another. That Belgian boy and girl at the bench next to mine, this noon they become engaged. Miss Herma, whose granddaughter was taken to Germany. Today she let me pray with her. One day Betsy's news touched us directly. A lady was transferred to the sewing detail today. When I introduced myself, she said, "Another one." What does she mean? Corrie, do you remember the day we were arrested? A man came to the shop. You were sick and I had to wake you up. I remembered very well the strange roving eyes, the uneasiness in the pit of my stomach. He worked with the Gestapo from the first day of occupation. He reported this woman's 2 brothers for resistance work, and finally her and her husband too. He came to Haarlem and teamed up with William and Captina. His name was Jan Vogel. Flames of fire seemed to leap around that name in my heart. I thought of Father's final hours, alone in a hospital corridor. Of all the underground work so abruptly halted, and I knew that if Jan Vogel stood in front of me now, I would kill him. I don't think she'd really kill him, but her anger is so great for this man that she very much at this moment would like to kill him. Betsy drew the little cloth bag from beneath her overalls and held it out to me, but I shook my head. Betsy kept the Bible during the day, since she had more chance to read and teach from it here than I did at the factory. In the evenings, we held a quiet prayer meeting for as many as would crowd around our bunk. You lead the prayers tonight, Betsy. I have a headache. More than a headache. All of me ached with the violence of my feelings about the man who had done us so much harm. That night I did not sleep, and the next day at my bench I scarcely heard the conversation around me. By the end of the week I had worked myself into such a sickness of body and spirit that Mr. Mormon stopped at my bench to ask if something were wrong. Wrong? Yes, something's wrong. I was only too eager to tell Mr. Mormon and all of Holland how Jan Vogel had betrayed his country. What puzzled me was Betsy. She suffered everything I suffered, and yet she seemed to carry no rage. "Betsy," I hissed one dark night, when I knew that my restless tossing must be keeping her awake. 3 of us now shared the single cot, as the crowded camp daily received new arrivals. "Betsy, don't you feel anything about John Vogel?" "Oh, yes, Corrie, terribly. I felt for him ever since I knew, and pray for him whenever his name comes in my mind. How he must be suffering." Now, this is a woman that's a great prayer warrior. This is a woman of great compassion. This is a woman of great encouragement, a woman of great strength and courage. Oh, yes, Corrie, terribly. I felt the same for him since I knew, and I prayed for him whenever his name comes into my mind, how he must be suffering. For a long time I lay silent. Once again I had the feeling that this sister, with whom I have spent all my life, belonged somehow to another order of beings. Wasn't she telling me in her gentle way that I was as guilty as Jan Vogel? For I had murdered him with my heart and with my tongue. Wow. That's something to think about. Murdered him with my heart and tongue. How many times in our anger, perhaps, have we murdered somebody in our anger and tongue? Lord Jesus, I whispered, I forgive John Vogel as I prayed that you will forgive me. I have done him great damage. Bless him now and his family. That night, for the first time since our betrayer had a name, I slept deep and dreamlessly. See, when our heart gets right with God, that's what happens. All anxiety, all anger, all that just drains from our body, and we finally get that great night of peace and rest in our spirit. The days in vault were a baffling mixture of good and bad. Morning roll call was often cruelly long as we stood at attention until our backs ached and our legs cramped. But the summer air was warm and alive with birds as the day approached. Gradually, a pink and gold sunrise would light the sky as Betsy and I squeezed each other's hand in awe. Again, they're drawing out their happiness, their joy, and all these little things. Sometimes that's what keeps us going. At 5:30, we had black bread and bitter coffee, and then marched off to the various work details. I looked forward to this hike to the factory. Part of the way, we walked beside a small woods. We also marched past a section of the men's camp, and many of our group strained to identify a husband or a son among the shaved heads and striped overalls. I was grateful to be again with people, but what I had not realized in solitary confinement was that to have companions meant to have their griefs as well. We all suffered with the woman whose men were in this camp. The discipline in the male section was much harsher than in the woman's, and executions were frequent. Almost every day, gunshots would send the anguish whisperers flying. Yet, in spite of sorrow and anxiety, and no one in that place was without both, there was laughter too, in the factory when guards were not around, an impersonation of the blustering second lieutenant, a game of blind man's bluff, a song passed in rounds from bench to bench. During the long, hot afternoons, talk died down as each sat alone with his or her own thoughts. I scratched on the side of the table the number of days until September 1st. I had heard a chance remark that 6 months was the usual prison term for ration card offenders. If that were the charge, and if they included the time served at Shevingen, September 1st would be our release date. So now she's hanging on to a little bit of hope. Still not quite clear of the charges. Corrie, Betsy warned, we don't know. I had the feeling, almost, that to Betsy it did not matter. I looked at her, sitting on our cot in the last moments before lights out, sewing up a split seam in my overalls as she had so often sat mending under the lamplight in the dining room. Betsy, by the very way she sat, evoked a high black chair behind her and a carpet at her feet instead of this endless row of metal cots on bare floor. I had the feeling she was as content to be reading the Bible here in vault to those who had never heard it as she had been serving soup to hungry people in the hallway of the BG. As for me, I set my heart every day more firmly on September 1st. Sounds like Betsy has learned from Paul to be content in whatever situation she finds herself in. Then all of a sudden, it looked as though we would not have to wait even this long. The Princess Irene brigade was rumored to be in France, moving toward Belgium. The brigade was part of the Dutch forces that escaped to England. Now it was marching to reclaim its own. The guards were tense. The sound of the firing squad was heard more and more often. Rumor was all we lived on as we waited out the days. Women who had stayed away from the whispered prayer service around our cot now crowded closer. September 1st came and went. Several days later, we awoke to the sound of distant explosions. Long before the roll call whistle, the entire barracks was up and milling about in the dark between the cots. Was it bombs? Artillery fire? Everyone's mind turned homeward. Everyone talked of what she would do first. At the factory, Mr. Mormon tried to calm us. "Those aren't bombs," he said, "and certainly not guns. That's demolition work. Germans. They were probably blowing up bridges. It means they expect an attack, but it might not come for weeks." But the blast came closer. Nothing could keep down hope. Now they were so near they hurt our ears. "Drop your lower jaw," Mr. Mormon called out. "Keep your mouth open and save your eardrums." After lunch, the order came to return to dormitories. With sudden urgency, women embraced husbands and sweethearts who worked beside them at factories. Betsy was waiting outside our barracks. "Corrie, has a braid come? Are we free?" "I don't know. Oh, Betsy, why am I so frightened?" The loudspeaker in the men's camp was sounding the signal for roll call. No order was given us, and we drifted about aimlessly, listening. Names were being read through the men's speaker, though it was too far for me to make them out. Suddenly, an insane fear gripped the waiting women. The loudspeaker had fallen silent. We exchanged wordless looks. Then rifle fire split the air. Around us, women began to weep. A second volley, a third. For 2 hours, the executions went on. Someone counted. More than 700 male prisoners were killed that day. Can you imagine the wives that are wanting hope that their husbands are alive, their sons? And now to hear that 700 have been killed in one day? Why all of a sudden the rush to kill these men? There was little sleeping in our barracks that night. In the morning, we were ordered to collect our personal things. Betsy and I put our belongings into the pillowcases, including a small bottle of vitamin oil that had come in a Red Cross package. I transferred the Bible in its bag from Betsy's back to my own. She was so thin it made visible bumps between her shoulders. About noon, the march exodus from camp began. Betsy hung hard to my arm. She was laboring for breath, as she has always did when she had walked any distance. I slipped my arm beneath Betsy's shoulders and half carried her. At the last path ended, we ended up facing the single railroad track. Over 1,000 women standing toe to heel. Farther along, the men's section was also at the siding. Freight cars standing on the tracks were for us. Already the men were being prodded aboard, clambering up over the high sides. We could not see the engine, just a small row of small, high-wheeled boxcars stretching out of sight in both directions, machine guns mounted at intervals on the roof. Soldiers approached along the tracks, pausing at each car to haul open the heavy sliding door. In front of us, a gaping black interior appeared. Women began to press forward, and we were swept along with the others. Betsy's chest was still heaving after the rapid march. I had to boost her over the side of the train. At first, I could not make out nothing in the dark car. Then, in a corner, I saw a stack of bread, dozens of flat, black loaves piled on top of one another. We were shoved against the back wall. 30 or 40 people were all that could fit in. Still, the soldiers drove women over the side, jabbing with their guns. When 80 women were packed inside, the door thumped shut, and we heard iron bolts driven into place. So only 30 or 40 could fit in a car, but they were cramming 80 of them in one car. You could probably hardly breathe. Women sobbed and many fainted. Although in the tight wedged crowd they remained upright, it seemed certain that those in the middle would suffocate or be trampled to death. But we worked out a system where, by half sitting, half lying with our legs around one another like members of a sledding team, we were able to get down on the floor of the car. Do you know what I'm thankful for? Betsy's gentle voice startled me. What could she be thankful for? She's in this cart. It's dark. They're huddled together. She's hurting, can't hardly breathe. And she said, I'm thankful that Father is in heaven today. Oh, Father, how would I have wept for you? The warm sun beat down on the motionless train. The temperature in the packed car rose, and the air grew foul. Beside me, someone was tugging at a nail in the ancient wood of the wall. At last it came free. With the point, she set to work gouging the hole wider. Others around the sides looked up the idea, and in a while, blessed whiffs of outside air began to circle around us. Now that's smart. So with this nail, they're making air holes so they can breathe a little bit easier and have some circulation. It was hours before the train began to move. Almost at once it stopped again, then crawled forward. The rest of the day and into the night it was the same, stopping, starting, slamming, jerking. Once, when it was my turn at the air hole, I saw the moonlight trainmen carrying a length of twisted rail. Tracks ahead must be destroyed. I passed the news. Maybe they would not be able to repair them. Maybe we could still be in Holland when liberation came. Betsy's forehead was hot to my hand. The girl behind me squeezed herself into an even tighter crouch so that Betsy could lie almost flat across my lap. I dozed too from time to time, my head on the shoulder of the kind girl behind us. Once I dreamed I could hear hailstones on Tangen's front windows. I opened my eyes. It was really hailing. I could hear it rattling along the side of the car. Everyone was awake now. Another storm of hail. And then we heard a burst of machine gun fire from the roof of the train. It's bullets, someone shouted. They're attacking the train. Again, we heard that sound like tiny stones striking the wall, and again the machine guns answered. The firing died away. For an hour the train sat motionless. Then we slowly crawled forward. As we crossed the border, we were in Germany. Not a place that I'm sure they expected to be. Wow, that's quite a powerful chapter. We've read almost 40 minutes. I think it was well worth it. It's hard to stop in the middle of a chapter when so much is going on, because we really want to get the full content of what is revealed in that chapter. All right, Lord willing, probably on Monday, I'm taking the weekend off. On Monday, we will do chapter 13, which is called Raven's Brook. Raven's Brook. All right, I hope you've enjoyed that reading again of The Hiding Place. And I'm going to have to kind of sit back and let this chapter absorb. So you might want to, well, it's too late now. I should have told you this earlier, but I'm sure sometimes we can stop it, go do something else, and then come back to pick up the reading of each chapter. However you do it, I'm glad you're doing it. I'm glad you're along on this journey. God bless each and every one of you. Have a most wonderful weekend in the Lord. And Lord willing, I'll be back on Monday with the next chapter. Take care.